Dobro večer, poštovani gledalci. Ovo je Intervju 1. Večera se bavimo temama koje su u fokusu javnosti već dugi niz godina. Prepoznavši potrebu za sveobuhvatnim pristupom pitanjima mobilnosti ljudi i međunarodnih migracija, kao i za unapređenje saradnje na globalnom nivou, 193 države članice UN-a usvojile su 19. septembra prošle godine u New Yorku deklaraciju o izbjeglicama i migrantima kojom su se obavezale na izradu globalnog sporazuma za sigurne, uređene i regularne migracije, takozvani GCM. O tome što ovaj sporazum podrazumijeva te kakav je trenutno položaj izbjeglica u svijetu, o balkanskoj ruti, kako se tretiraju, što su globalni izazovi u tretiranju ove problematike, u ovom ekskluzivnom intervjuu će nam pojasniti subregionalni koordinator za Zapadni Balkan pri UN-ovoj Međunarodnoj organizaciji za migracije, gospodin Peter van de Auweraert. Good evening and welcome to the program.
Thank you very much for having me.
First of all, let's explain the GCM agreement and its cause. Who is it meant for and how should it contribute to resolving, let's say, main issues concerning the migrants?
As you, I think, mentioned in your introduction, in September of last year, there was a New York Declaration for Refugees and Migrants. This was in a certain way a historic declaration in the sense that the states at the global level decided to collaborate on a framework to better manage migration in the world. There has been a long-standing international convention for refugees, but when it comes to migrants, migrants was always seen as something that the states wanted to control themselves, also because many states have many different interests. Some states are the origin for migrants to leave from, while other states are receiving migrants, and they don't necessarily always see eye to eye when it comes to deciding what should be done in terms of migration management. So it was the first time that states came together at the global level and said, okay, we see that migration is a growing phenomenon. In 2015, there were about 250 million migrants around the world, and we need to have better global collaboration to manage migration in the interest of the states themselves, but also in the interest of the migrants. The New York Declaration contained a commitment of those states to work together to, by the end of 2018, so next year, to have this global compact on migration, which will set out a number of concrete actions to improve migration management.
Such as?
For example, how to ensure that migrants also benefit from their basic human rights, how to encourage regular migration, how to facilitate regular migration in circumstances like, for example, in Europe, where the labor market needs more migrants, but where maybe the regulations are very strict to open up places like Europe for migration. But even for the migrants that go to countries on an irregular basis, how do you make sure that kids that arrive in the country have access to education as quickly as possible? How can you improve coordination between the country where a migrant comes from and a country where the migrant is going to, for example, when it comes to documentation. If children are born, what we have seen now, for example, in Greece, people leave one country, they get stranded in Greece, their kids are born, how do they get a nationality? How do they get their documents? These are all basic rights that migrants have, independent whether they are regular migrants.
Are those rights respected over the course of time? What we've seen, for example, in the Balkan route?
I think globally there are a lot of problems with the application of basic human rights to migrants. We see far too many instances where migrants are detained, where migrants are badly treated, where migrants do not have access to the police, do not have access to the justice system because they don't have the right papers, and where therefore they are vulnerable to exploitation by criminals, criminal networks and so on. So there certainly are gaps when you look at it globally in terms of the protection for human rights. I think the Balkan route was quite specific in the sense that people were transiting at the height of the crisis in 2015, 2016. People were spending very little time in the Western Balkans. They were coming from Greece into Macedonia, traveling through immediately to Serbia, and then into
the countries
Hungary.
Of European
exactly.
Union.
So in that sense, they didn't stay very much. There were not so many issues related to not having access to rights. I think generally, I think it's important to underline that. I think when I focus on Macedonia and Serbia, the governments there, I think they have treated migrants while they were transiting with respect and humanity, and with respect for their basic human rights in terms of how they were treated.
In the media over the course of time. But how to redefine migration policies when the challenges are bigger now than, let's say, for example, 10 years ago?
I think what states have realized is that migration is a phenomenon that has always been there. It is not because Europe, to use the example of Europe, does not provide access legally to migrants that they don't come, as we are seeing every day at the shores of Italy, for example. So Europe, these migrants are coming because there are opportunities for them in Europe. On the other hand, there are countries that have a lot of difficulties in finding jobs for their own young people because they have a rapidly growing population. And I think states are realizing that both these countries, the countries that send the migrants and the countries where migrants want to go to, have an interest in regulating how are we going to manage, on the one hand, the need for labor there, and on the other hand, the desire of migrants and the lack of economic opportunities for those migrants in their countries of origin. We can decide not to regulate, then we have a lot of irregular migration with all the deaths, with all the issues that we are seeing now in the Mediterranean today, or we can try to regulate it so that migration benefits the countries where people go to and the countries where people are coming from. So I think there is a convergence of interest. Having said that, I think the negotiations will be very difficult because of the fact that different states in the world have different interests,
policies and interests. Yes. But what are the main issues the migrants are facing at this point in the world, let's say globally?
I think the main issue is that we first have to say there are a large number of migrants for whom migration does not cause particular problems. There are within the European Union, within the African Union, and migrants can move to countries where they want to work. That goes without problems. Those that suffer often are the ones that are irregular. If people do not have the right papers to be in a country, that opens up to a whole range of exploitation by employers who, if they no longer like the person, can fire the person, who can not pay salaries.
They have no coverage whatsoever.
They have no coverage whatsoever. A small accident at work can become a catastrophe because they don't have access to healthcare. They become vulnerable to smugglers. We've seen, for example, images, I'm sure you have also shown them on your channel, what is happening in Libya, where African migrants are being detained, tortured, forced to pay money by smugglers.
And so thrown to human trafficking as well.
Exactly. And so trafficking, I think, is another a huge area. But I think it's really the irregular migrants that are extremely vulnerable today in terms of the fact that they often do not have protection, even though they also have basic rights. It's not because you don't have a document that you don't have certain basic rights that should be respected.
What do countries need to do to identify the human trafficking victims? We have seen over the course of time that the countries are very much identifying everybody as a migrant. But of course we have different sorts of migrants, let's say. We have refugees, we have victims of human trafficking. What do they do? What do they need to do in order to identify victims of human trafficking? And what to do when they do identify them?
Well, I think first of all, a very first step is that you have to have the right legal frameworks in place. You have the frameworks in place that allow authorities, when they discover victims of trafficking, not simply to deal them as migrants that don't have the right papers and put them in detention and return them back home, but actually provide adequate care to those victims of trafficking. So the first step is legislation. However, we see that in many countries, including in the Western Balkans, legislation alone is not enough. You have to implement. That means that you have to train your border guards so that they can identify who is simply a migrant and who is a migrant who is a victim of trafficking. We worked very closely with the border guards in Serbia and Macedonia when there were the large numbers of migrants crossing through, to help them to identify. If you see, for example, 3, 4, 5, 6 children that are seemingly with a person who is not related to them, well, that could be a sign. The kids are fearful, they don't speak, they don't seem to have a bond with the adult that they are with. That could be a sign that these kids are being trafficked. So we were training the border guards on how do you identify victims of trafficking.
Are you satisfied with how they trained at this point?
I think the situation in terms of their ability to recognize victims of trafficking is steadily increasing. That does not mean, I think, that there is not no gaps and that further capacity building is not required. And this is something that we are doing currently with the support of the donor funding that we have for this.
All right.
But then once you have identified the victims of trafficking, you still need to take action. And for that you need to have a referral mechanism where you have either specialized state institutions or specialized NGOs that can provide the required care to those victims of trafficking. That could be psychosocial support, it could be support to help them to get their documents back, it could be support for them to contact their families and get in touch with their families, it could be support to help them to return back home. And for that you need to have the right referral mechanisms in place, which also means, of course, that in the state budget, countries have to provide money for those services. So there's a whole holistic approach that you need to apply to really be able to assist victims of trafficking. And I think one final point is very important, not to criminalize victims of trafficking. For example, we still see in countries where, for example, women that are trafficked in the sex industry get penalized because they offer sex services. Now they are the victims, they are not the criminals. So you really need to have the legislation in place that does not criminalize victims of trafficking. You do not criminalize a male who is trafficked to work illegally in a construction site. You don't arrest that person for working without papers because he's not the perpetrator, he's the victim. So that is something that is really important in terms of legislation.
There's a thin line between subjectively identifying and being knowing how to identify the victim. There's a thin line. I think it takes a lot of work and a lot of training for the government to put that in place in any case. Those are the regular routes. What about the irregular routes? I think that's a huge challenge for the UN, Human Rights Watch, and the IOM. How to deal with that issue, with the irregular routes and the migrants out there?
Yeah, I think, I think first of all, it's important to emphasize that, of course, as we know, when we talk about the Western Balkans, the Balkans route has been closed officially, but that has, of course, increased to a certain degree migrant smuggling, i.e., as you said, irregular movements of migrants, because it's more difficult for them to move regularly. Now, how do you monitor those? First, I think it's important to increase the capacity of the border police and the border guards, to give them the tools, to give them the training, to give them the equipment, so that they can monitor what goes on at the borders. That is, I think, a given. That is something that needs to be done. And I think that is something that in the Western Balkans, the countries with the support, especially of the European Union, have certainly done. Then the next thing, and that's something that IOM has something we call that the displacement tracking matrix. It's not a very elegant name, but it's essentially a mechanism whereby we have teams at the border, teams at places where we know that irregular migrants go. For example, I'll give you an example, the bus station in Belgrade,
in the center of the city.
In the center. So we have people there who count the migrants that are going through and who also approach migrants to see whether they have any concerns. And that type of mechanisms whereby you try to monitor the flows, I think that is very important. It's not just important for law enforcement, but it is also important for addressing those vulnerabilities that we were talking about earlier, and to make sure that amongst those group of irregular migrants, people have access to the support that they require.
The Balkan route is best understood as the unfolding of, let's say, two parallel processes. For example, first of all, involving population structure of the migrant population to the European Union, and the gradual replacement of criminal mechanisms of migration with government mechanisms. How to deal with this? How does the IOM tackle this issue?
Well, I think that you're very right in pointing out that there's been a criminal element in terms of the smugglers that are helping the migrants to cross into Europe. I mean, I think there is a whole network of people, often the same people that were involved in the trafficking of human beings, but also often the same networks that are involved in the trafficking of weapons, that are involved in the trafficking of drugs, who see that as another business opportunity in a way. Even within the smugglers, there are smugglers that deliver the services that they promise to the migrants, if I can put it in that way. Right. And there are others that are really simply wanting to exploit people as much as possible. We're seeing that now when people are put on the boats in Libya, where it is very clear that these boats will sink as soon as they are 5 meters into the water, these smugglers are not interested in helping these people to get to Italy. They're simply trying to get as much money as they can and then put them onto the water.
Way to the standing point, and that's it.
Yeah, and that's it. That is definitely that has been the case. How you can work with that, I think, is there's a number of different issues. First of all, I think there needs to be space for legal migration, because again, there are a lot of people that are living in circumstances where they don't really have a lot of hope or economic opportunities to create not even a fantastic life, but a life that fulfills a decent life that fulfills their basic human needs. So there is going to be a push factor to come to richer areas. Those richer areas need the labor, as we discussed earlier, so you need to legalize. Once you legalize to a certain extent, these people can come without any need for criminal networks. The second or the third component is that you need to investigate and prosecute those people involved in smuggling. It is an illegal activity, and I think within the Western Balkans and within Europe, there's certainly been an investment in doing more criminal investigations, trying to prosecute more people in terms of smuggling.
We cannot go on without tackling the issue that there are certain examples among the migrants committing certain criminal acts, especially in the countries of Western Europe. Probably it has been a huge challenge for the IOM to talk to the governments, for example, of the countries of Western Europe, in order to try to find a way settlement for the migrants, taking in concern and in consideration that there have been certain let's say, actions done, for example, in Paris, if we take Paris, for example, what happened there and in Germany, how to tackle that? How do you talk to the governments of those countries in order to get the migrants and help them out and going through the program that the IOM is already in place?
Well, I think we don't have to be romantic about migrants. Migrants are like any other population. There is the vast majority of people are, like we all are, law-abiding citizens, and there is a minority that commits crimes, like in any comparable...
In a society, let's say.
In a society, you always have people that commit crimes. So I think that is the first observation. So we shouldn't dramatize the issue of crime within migrant community.
Isn't it dramatized in for example, in France?
Well,
at that time?
I think there is always, well, first of all, secondly, I think it's of course clear that we should strongly condemn terrorist acts or crimes committed by migrants, as we would do if those terrorist acts or criminal acts would be committed by any other citizen. We should not feel that we cannot criticize or condemn these type of actions. We should be very clear. There is no tolerance for what happened in Paris or in Brussels. I myself was at the Brussels airport when the explosion happened. So we cannot. It's clear that we have to take a very strong stand on that. But of course, there's always the political exploitation. People that are against migration will use that as an excuse and say, "Look, of course, we've been telling this. We shouldn't have migrants because look what they are doing." And I think we have to be very careful not to judge the whole migrant population by the fact that there are a small number of people.
And I think France already showed that by choosing Macron as a president, actually, that it's definitely the case. Let's not judge the whole group. Let's not generalize the whole group and judge them by few people out there.
And I think, if I may, I think the media has an important role to play. I think, first of all, in not sensationalizing the extent to which migrants participate in crime or terrorism, but also to highlight, and I think that's really important, to highlight more also the positive sides of migration, in the sense that there are many stories that can be told of migrants who have achieved incredible things, especially if you think from where they came. And I think, and this is one of the things that IOM together with UNHCR and with others has been working upon, how do you bring those positive stories about migrants who came from Somalia to Belgium and became eventually a professor at the university or have a startup.
Serve as a good example for everybody who tries to, let's say, lead that decent life anywhere else but where, let's say, in a country of war, a country of origin, where it's not possible anymore. What does the IOM have planned in a certain, let's say, up to end of 2018 until the GCM agreement, hopefully, is being adopted and all other aspects of the GCM agreement? What are the other plans that IOM has in place for the countries of the Western Balkans?
So for the countries of the Western Balkans, we have the first event around the Global Compact for Migration that will take place here in Sarajevo on Thursday. It's a first for the Western Balkans, and we are trying to bring together a series of actors, government, civil society, academia, the private sector, to discuss what should be in this Global Compact for Migration. And we're going to repeat that in each country in the Western Balkans, hoping that we will, by that, kickstart a process of national consultations around this Global Compact for Migration. Because I would like to highlight that I think the Western Balkans as a whole have a lot to contribute. Why? Because unfortunately you have the experience of forced migration with the Yugoslav wars, where you had a lot of refugees and internally displaced people. You have gained a lot of experience how to deal with that. You have experience, maybe also, not maybe, also enforcement with displacement because of natural disasters like floods, for example, like you had here in Bosnia and Herzegovina. But you also have a very large diaspora. So you also have experience with people that leave from here. So this is all the knowledge
that we can bring in order to adopt certain policies.
And then you have the experience now because of the migration crisis in 2015, 2016, what it means to have thousands of people from elsewhere coming into your own area. So I think if you bring all of that together, the Western Balkans really has experienced all the different facets of migration. So I think there is really a lot of experience to contribute to this global discussion on how can we improve.
And there's a lot to learn from each other,
absolutely,
I suppose.
Yes, absolutely.
Mr. van der Auweraert, thank you very much for being my guest.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Poštovani gledalci, bio je to gospodin Peter van der Auweraert iz Međunarodne organizacije za migracije za intervju 1 BHT1. Hvala za pažnju, doviđenja.